driving advertising online, but also the fuel that consumers are becoming increasingly aware of giving up and of its value. And as they not only invoke ad blockers, but also watch the ways in which data is being collected from them, the question arises whether the cost-benefit ratio really is there for them, whether they really are seeing the benefit from this massive collection of data that's happening on all levels, from all different quarters, not just from advertisers, but from everyone. And the increasing demand to see some benefit for it, or to have greater control of it. This is a very complicated issue. Obviously, it touches on just about everything we've been talking about and will be talking about today. But we wanted to focus specifically on data collection here and the policies around it, the likelihood of future regulation, and that basic relationship between consumers and brands when it comes to data exchange. To take the lead on this panel, we have our own reporter on all policy matters, Wendy Davis. Wendy's been reporting for a number of years at MediaPost, edits the Online Examiner, which looks at these at issues of policy. Please welcome Wendy and her panel.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm here with Nate Carter from Managing Director at Media Associates, Bob Gelman, a longtime privacy consultant and privacy advocate, Siona Listikin, a professor at George Mason University, and Jules Polonetsky, another longtime privacy expert who now heads the think tank Future of Privacy Foundation, a forum, sorry. So let me just get started with the question that Steve posed and that the panel, the description poses. For a long time, we've heard that consumers will benefit by letting their data be collected, that advertisers and marketers will collect data and they will use it to serve better ads, that more relevant ads, that the marketers will be able to make more efficient use of their ad budgets, and that consumers will benefit by getting ads for products they're interested in. Is this, start with Bob, do you think that is what's happening, and do you think that that is a fair exchange, that consumers are being asked to give up data for better ads?
Well, personally, I don't think so, and some of the economists have begun to look at these kinds of activities, and they're finding that all the benefits go to the companies and the consumers get hardly anything out of this. One of the fears is that, if you start looking at economist supply and demand curves, that the consumer surplus that comes as a result of standard market pricing will begin to disappear as companies can target individuals and set prices based on those individuals rather than others. Another concern is that all of this data will end up being used in other ways that aren't anticipated, so all of a sudden the data will be used to deny your ability to get on an airplane, or the data will be used by a cop who pulls your car over and decides whether to pull his gun out when he approaches your car or not based on your score, all kinds of characteristics that are unknown to anyone in the real world.
So those are two very different concerns, but just going to the first one of the consumer surplus, you're talking about price discrimination, right? You're talking.
Yes.
Yeah. And is there, let me ask the other panelists, is there any reason now to think that that is happening or could happen?
So there have been a number of studies that have noted that wither the price discrimination, right? That we keep expecting certain sellers to really start price discriminating, not based on context, but on targeting. And that hasn't yet happened in both a legal or illegal way. So whether it's to come, it is not happening writ large yet.
So let's just talk about discrimination in general, because it's one of these like explosive words. Many of you are in the business of discriminating, making decisions, showing different things, offering different things to different people for different reasons. And a wide range of discrimination is completely appropriate and a very good thing to do. You are discriminating in what you choose to eat. You make sure you eat healthy foods. Illegal discrimination, where we've got laws and we've got a societal consensus that thou shalt not do this, all right, obviously we all agree, shouldn't happen. And so I think when we talk about discrimination online, we're really talking about two things. One is there illegal stuff that somehow isn't being captured and caught because it's underground, it's happening in algorithms, we don't even know, maybe we didn't even intend it, right? And I think reasonable people should agree, well, wait, yeah. In fact, in a bunch of sectors, it doesn't matter whether you know, if you end up having a disparate impact and you're in the banking business, you're screwed because you have an obligation to know. But then there's a whole bunch of other areas where we don't have societal consensus. Like price discrimination. There are times where rich people end up paying more things because, well, they want things quick and fast, right? Is there some sort of price decisioning being made, however, that I'm not aware of when I navigate around? And clearly there is some, right? If I came to the site because I'm an affiliate, I might be recovering my expenses and market it up and so forth. And we never get to the nub of maybe so, and if so, is this the kind that ought to be illegal? So there is some new awareness that social media data is being used to have cops make better decisions about whether to batter down your door with a battering ram by knowing something. And we're kind of looking at that and we're saying that's probably bad data, it's probably risky, and it's probably dangerous. Should that be used?
Well, Jules, I think there's a difference, though, between the data that people voluntarily put on social media sites and the data that is kind of collected by tracking them across the web.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of this has to do with transparency, and I think that a challenge that the consumer faces right now is there is a lack of transparency in the system as it relates to advertising. No one would object to price discrimination if, Starbucks, I hit my star limit and I get a free coffee because I know you punch the card a certain number of times, you get the free coffee. But if you're engaging in price gouging, if you're engaging in different pricing for different subsegments of the population, and there's no transparency as to the offers that are being made to other people, that's a problem.
What do you mean price gouging? I enforced New York City's price gouging law when I was the Consumer Affairs Commissioner, right? If there was a disaster and you raised prices, I had a very aggressive statute, and I could say, not fair, you're taking advantage of people. In a bunch of other areas, we say, well, spikes in demand are good because then more Uber vehicles, if I understand that I'm going to be paying $1,000 for an Uber when I'm drunk late New Year's Eve, we're like, good. Now, whether it works and whether the cars are already, whether it ends up being efficient or not, but let me just argue, price gouging, and the market driving prices up are some interesting areas to debate. And I think we're holding the ed tech industry sort of hostage when we haven't agreed as to what we really want you doing or not. And it's not just the ed tech industry. Let's take Google, let's take a lot of these algorithms. I was just on a call and was sort of going through this notion of, we don't want the Google ads being racist, right? Because that shows, how dare they show, ads that say, do a criminal background check if I search for
that's an old issue.
American
that
name.
Issue is at least 5 years old.
Right? But do we want a world, did anyone see that movie Shallow Hal, where he walks around and he's in love with this very large, woman who's really, Gwyneth Paltrow, but, she's very fat, but she seems like she's very skinny. Do we want, search the word Jew on Google. Do you know what you get? The top result is a Klan kind of white supremacist group, and Google doesn't change that. They say, yeah, unfortunately, this is what happens. And so we first need to agree or disagree about what we want, and then we can say to companies, do not discriminate in this way. But right now, it's sort of a cat and mouse game of like, ooh, that looks creepy, that looks unfair, stop doing it.
I think that what Bob, and you can jump in here, is talking about is more what I think the Journal reported a few years ago of going to a website and they have basic geo-targeting capabilities and then just show you different prices based on your zip code. Or there was another report about one of the travel websites showing different ads and different results to people based on whether they were using a Mac or a PC. And I think that's the kind of thing that Bob is talking about.
Well, it is, but I want to acknowledge that price discrimination is a very complicated issue. So, for example, plenty of businesses offer lower prices to seniors. Nobody objects to that. And I've said to people, and by the way, I was introduced as a privacy advocate. I'm not. At least I don't think I'm a privacy advocate, but most people categorize me that way. So you can make your own choice if you care. I've said to people on price discrimination issues, whatever you do, don't try and upset the discounts for seniors. because that just simply won't fly. And if you look around, there are certainly a lot of other kinds of things that go on that no one objects to. So cheaper prices for servicemen, cheaper prices for returning buyers, cheaper prices for new buyers. A lot of these things go on. Cheaper prices if you go to the movies before 6 o'clock. A lot of these things go on, and nobody objects to them. And transparency is one of the reasons that a lot of these things work. It's not necessarily sufficient, but because people can't tell. And on the other hand, though, even though people can't tell, the net gives people an opportunity to share information and to post information, if they want to, about the prices that they were offered. And this gives people a way to fight back, because if I find out that you gave Jules a lower price than you gave me, that's the end of our relationship.
So, Nate, let me ask you, what do marketers think of all of this data? Do marketers want or even need all of this data that's being collected?
I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's going to vary by the size and type of marketer. What we've seen from a lot of the data is that, and a lot of what's being discussed today, it really comes down to retargeting. I think retargeting is sort of like the big thing that is overhanging our industry. And it's an attribution problem within the digital ecosystem. So this last touch attribution has led to retargeting. It's led to a number of companies that have built models that were essentially taking credit for retargeting and then running algorithms and using all this incredible third-party data on the back end to also target ads, which, as an earlier question pointed out, still are not very well targeted. And so as we begin to move as an industry towards better attribution, I do think the value of a lot of this third-party data for most advertisers is not what it's been made out to be over the last 5 years.
Now, just to be clear, when you talk about retargeting, that's something, you don't consider that third-party data? You consider that first-party data?
I would consider that first-party data because the user made a choice to go to the website of the organization that's retargeting you. And then what has happened in the past is 30 other organizations will race to get the last touch, so serve the last ad to that person and get credit for the conversion.
And so that's why the same ads, the same retargeted ads keep appearing.
They'll appear out of context and bad places.
But we should note that the industry self-regulatory programs do indeed, despite some confusion and debate in industry around this issue, consider this to be quote-unquote OBA or behavioral advertising. You're getting an ad tailored based on your web surfing on one side, on another side. It's a profile. It happens to be a skinny profile, right? Not a broad one, and it may not be sold to many, many marketers. It might be sold back only to the, the advertiser or the publisher, but you would be subject to the DAA opt-out and notice. And I'd argue that if we started telling consumers, you go to a website, the ads are selected for you. If it's a true profile that's, sold and so forth, then you can opt out. If it's only the last site, the ad that's following you around, which is probably what most consumers know of as target, well, then that won't be covered. And if it's third-party appended data that I've purchased and linked, well, that's another thing. And by the way, you used to be able to clear cookies, but now you got to use this opt-out tool, but that might not work. And then on mobile, there's limit ad tracking, but not everyone uses that. Like, this is why we're in this thing where nobody has any trust in the system. My argument is, this is all good. Nobody's not letting you go on planes. There's value to the industry. There's value to the ecosystem. But we got to make it work so that when people do say no, they say no. And I'd like it to be more relevant. I bought a hotel room in Israel next week, and I'm getting retargeted all week. Could you have the data to start giving me the upsell to a better room or something, or some benefit?
So Joel, what you're saying, these are two kind of contradictory lines that we keep hearing. And one is that there's too much data being collected, and because of that, consumers, they find the retargeted ads creepy, they're installing ad blockers. And then, on the other hand, if just more data was collected, then the ad targeting would be more precise, and then people would theoretically like the ads more. Is there any way to reconcile these two
contradictory? Put the publishers back in charge. It is the consumer goes to a website, goes to that experience. If the people whose job was giving you a good experience at a site were actually in control of whether the ad was too aggressive, popped out of its spot, was a pop-up, so forth, you would see, and often those are the usability people who are not happy with the fact that what's happening in that corner of the box. So here's the problem. We've broken up the web into two things. People whose job is to give you a really good experience and so forth, and tailor and try to get you to come back, maybe even pay and subscribe, and yes, have commerce there. And then, hey, I've outsourced that box. What's happening over there? I don't know. Go talk to them. I'm not really in control of that. And that's not, that's not the ideal balance. So if there were more publishers who actually could say, hey, we're taking this off the table, we really care about our user experience, why do you have to pay ad block to force somebody to give you a good ad that doesn't give you a bad experience, right? Like just somebody else taking another bite out of the dollar. And I get that there's hard economics here, so it's easy for me on the policy side, although I spent tons of years in the industry sort of making these arguments. And when AOL had a lot of leverage, we do this, right? 10, 15 years ago, we would say, no, it's not. And as the market dynamic has changed, it's become a bit of a messy system.
Let me ask, Siona, you have studied kind of industry self-regulation, you've studied compliance systems. Is there a good way right now for consumers to control their experience online and data collection about them?
Well, I think what Jules has already said is no, right? So we've had a number of examples here of where you're opting out, you're not opting out of everything. You're not opting out of what you think you're opting out.
Are you talking about the cross-device part? You opt out from one device but not from other devices, or?
All of the above. So earlier we had the example of Forbes basically asking you to opt in, right? That if you didn't disable the ad blocker, then you wouldn't be able to access the content, right? So that's a great example of it. That's as clear as we're getting right now, except that that choice is still not very transparent, right? That what we should say is, by the way, we don't really know what our ad networks are doing, right? We don't really know what
because the ad network ended up serving malware to those people.
And we're going to be collecting data on you and holding it for a bunch of different years. So, And I'm sorry, if I can also just jump in.
Yes, please.
And put a note of data utopianism, that it might be that this programmatic data, beyond retargeting and beyond contextual data, is not yet giving us relevance. I think the idea is that one day it will. And that's why there's over-collection, with the hope that one day we're going to get this science right and really be able to target and perhaps price discriminate and perhaps be able to serve a better experience.
Why does anyone say relevant, by the way? I mean, I get that it works, so you click or you buy, which is relevant from the advertiser or marketer point of view, but nobody is actually saying, what does this user really want to see? Let me choose amongst all my ads which might be most relevant. No, it's who's got the highest CPM for this user, which means they're willing to bid the most, which presumably means that the market means that it's most worthwhile because they'll buy, right? Try to buy something that's not relevant on Google, right? To their credit, they have this auction system sort of set up so that maybe, your credit card, credit card people don't like targeting credit card searchers because you probably are getting swamped by credit cards unless you don't have good credit, in which case you're searching for credit cards, right? If you want to reach Porsche buyers with your credit card ad, they're like, that's not relevant. Someone doesn't expect to get a credit card ad when they search for a Porsche. So we keep saying relevant, but again, ask the publisher what he thinks is relevant, for his pages. I search, you too, I search for some very ugly things on the internet and some very nasty videos. You all do, whatever it is. And have you seen the kinds of Fortune 50 video ads that show up in front of the horrible stuff that you have purchased for? I'm like, oh my God, do these brands know? But the publisher, right, of this site has clearly little control over what's being placed. Now you're all thinking about what exactly I'm searching for. It's not so bad. I'm a nerdy Washington guy, but.
Nate.
Well, I think what you're talking about as well, though, is there is a distortion in the market. And I keep coming back to retargeting because, again, those are the high bids that tend to clear. It's when those ads are the ones that most often fall outside of context. And when you peel back, and if you're running good attribution on the back end, then it gets rid of some of the market distortions that exist.
Pop-ups worked, though, right? Pop-ups worked, and they worked, and they worked. And we had a hard time, stopping them until the browsers came in and stopped them because they did work, right? So
ask Netflix, if you're old enough to remember them, spamming you with pop-ups in the back.
Can I make a point? This fight about we need more data so we can target you better has gone on forever, and the problem today is what's happened with the technology. The people in the industry have the capability to track everywhere you go, everything you do, every web page you see, every link you click on, everything you look at in a store, collects so much information about you, and the whole purpose of this is to make the ad system a little bit more efficient. The prize here is not worth the cost. That's what a consumer will say.
But I would say, I mean, we're very focused on the online, but a father didn't find out several years ago from Target that his daughter was pregnant from an online ad. It was a direct mail piece that ended up in their mailbox. And so this really goes well beyond the online ad ecosystem. And one of the challenges, I think, in even having this discussion is when you look at what Edward Snowden released, and people have so little, who's going to solve it if not self-regulation? Are we going to trust the United States government to solve this problem? I mean, from the political campaigns and their advertising, which are probably the most intrusive. I mean, I sat down with the head of a campaign several years ago, 4 years ago, and they asked me to skip the privacy portion of my presentation because they said they didn't care. They're not going to solve it because it's an advantage to them, and a lot of this exists offline. So if not self-regulation, then who's going to solve it?
California.
Tech platforms are going to solve it if industry doesn't solve it first, followed quickly by California. Maybe they'll race to see who provides it for it. But I saw tech platforms fix pop-ups. They're now trying to fix, and I get their motives are very mixed when it comes to exactly their business models. But we don't make it easy when we layer on a giant privacy reason for folks who have different incentives to say, well, that's a privacy problem. Let's just turn that off.
So by tech platforms, do you mean the browsers?
Browsers, operating systems. We run a self-regulatory program for the companies that track your phone when you move around this hotel, right? Counting the Wi-Fi or Bluetooth physical, right, real-world MAC addresses to do sort of analytics for the space, the Euclids and others. And Apple said, well, it's kind of creepy, and we have a different model. Download an app, use a beacon, and that's kind of creepy. It created a privacy alarm, so we're going to rotate the MAC addresses because we don't want that to become a identifier that's used globally. And so it was a lot easier. Now, maybe they would have done it anyway, but it was certainly a lot easier, and they were applauded by privacy advocates who said, oh, we don't think we like that. So great, go for it, Apple.
So there was a big effort by the ad platforms to start a do not track header. And the idea is that this would be better. The industry has always relied on cookies to opt out of tracking, but cookies aren't stable, and also new companies come up and they weren't included in the original opt-out, so they're not universal. But the idea was that the browsers would all offer a do not track setting, and people could turn it on once, and then every site they went to or every ad network they encountered would know that they didn't want to be tracked. And that effort at first the ad industry said it was going to participate in that effort and was going to support it. They ended up withdrawing from the effort. There are standards now that have just been kind of developed by the do not track people who've been working on it, but I think that a lot of people think that that effort really has failed. Let me ask all of you, what do you think? Do you think that that kind of effort could ever work?
I suspect not. Self-regulation in this area is solely for political purposes. Self-regulation comes along in response to threats of legislation or regulation. When those threats disappear, the self-regulation disappears. There's a whole long list of privacy self-regulatory organizations that came and went, and the reason is all political. And if we get a Republican president, all of the existing privacy self-regulation activities will begin to diminish and disappear because the pressure will be off.
Have you seen that happen before?
Yes, it has happened before. I could name some of the privacy self-regulatory systems that were in place before, and you won't even recognize them. IRSG, PLI, OPA, they all disappeared when the politics changed.
I would state that it wasn't a Republican president who told me to skip the privacy, but you have deeper knowledge than I do in this area.
So look, if you put a collection of people who think the free market is great, advertising is powering the world, the free flow of data is good, who's really being harmed here anyway? By the way, we have a good self-regulation program. And then you put another group in the room that says, this is pretty much bad, and people should have maximum control, not just over ads, but even logging it or collecting it. And you say, design a switch. And one group's, well, fine, but it better be on the other side of the world and not do much. And the other is like, no, it should be in front of you, and you should choose whether it's on or off every time you get on the internet. And you say, agree, that's not going to happen, right? The reality is there's a lot of us sitting sort of in the middle saying, well, okay, well, can we do better here? Like, we have this messy system now where some things work, this opt-out works on this works on mobile. We might have hammered out, and I think this is not just the do not track. Look at the NTIA process, in Washington, the Department of Commerce process, where, in front of the glare of cameras, the guerrillas on each side are shooting at each other, and then there are lots of folks in the middle saying, I'll give you some more control, just don't ruin my business, and can we just make this work in a way that consumers might like, but not turn all off. So I think the dynamic is wrong, but I'm in the self-regulation business, and I will tell you, if you're ready to take the scars and say, we're doing this anyway, would you like to be part of the process? Or if there's a big stick, like the government's going to legislate, or drones won't fly unless you get privacy right, you can see painful consensus forced. Do not track was a missed opportunity, but here's one that I hope you don't miss, because again, this will be done to you by the mobile systems of the world. We have a do not track option today, right? Both mobile apps, both mobile ecosystems give us global ad identifiers. Very nice that they created those globally, not per network. That's a lot of data sharing. And they said whoever uses this has to follow the limit ad tracking setting. And by the way, it's a violation of your terms of service, not just you're on the internet, you don't like what the browser's rules are, you ignore them. This is what you've agreed to do as an app developer. And the fact that there is poor compliance in the ad tech ecosystem for working with the advertising identifier limit ad tracking settings that both Google and Apple provide is a recipe for disaster. They will enforce that at some point in some way. And so the fact that people don't pass that on, I'm not responsible, I think is going to be a big tragedy. That is a do not track of sorts, and it's a friendly one. It doesn't tell you stop collecting. It does say use this, and we're not respecting the ones that we can use that hardly anyone uses in a way that we're obligated to do. So that's a big problem. That's self-regulation by contract that's not even being respected.
So Nate, you were saying before that you thought that a lot of the third-party data wasn't actually that valuable, that when your clients or you do campaigns based on data, a lot of that is retargeting. But even beyond that, I mean, what do you think the most valuable kinds of ads are, actually?
I think it's contextual relevance still trumps whether or not I eat a parfait for breakfast. So, and I gave the example of what Beats did with their headphones and using Richard Sherman and other people, and they ran those ads with NFL players inside NFL games, not during the Oscars, not during, Ellen, because they knew that the audience would resonate with the creative, and the response rates are higher. And in part, again, I keep coming back to attribution. I think that if advertisers can get the attribution question right, a lot of these questions we're debating will lose their relevancy for most advertisers.
That's interesting. Let me ask Jules this first. How has ad tracking and data collection changed just in the last, say, 2 or 3 years?
Things that were sort of a gleam in our eye have been worked out to be more efficient, for better or worse, right? God knows.
There was a time when a lot of advertisers and ad tech companies said nothing that we do or collect is personally identifiable. It's all anonymous, it's all based on cookies, and it's just kind of one computer talking to another and serving ads. And I think in the last, I'm going to say 2 years, maybe 5 years, I think that has changed. But Jules, what are you seeing?
I think other than a slice of industry, there's not a lot of support for the notion that I can single someone out, maintain state with them throughout a day, have a wide range of data points about them, and not call that personal. The Europeans have made that very clear. The FTC, obviously when it comes to kids' privacy, made it clear that just using a tracking identifier is personal. And when we've said to the FTC, oh, well, because for kids, right? And they've said, no, that's our view. If you can link to a device, we had the rulemaking authority here to take action on it in the kids area. But we believe that, and we've said that multiple times. And take a look at Acxiom. Acxiom doesn't claim that their device linked data is anonymous, right? They call it device identifiable. We've been working on a set of definitions that tries to avoid this, oh, and therefore you can't do it, right? Because why are we calling it not personal? Either we have clients who've said, I don't share personal information, and we're sharing data, or we're running into sort of statutes. So the train has left on whether or not a global identifier, again, the mobile ad stuff maybe put a stake in this, right? People sync up cookies and so forth, but the mobile identifiers, which are global and can be shared widely and can be linked to PII by clients here and there. So simply saying, I have this thing and I don't have your explicit name by it, but I can single you out, treat you differently. There are lookup databases. It fails every definition. We could continue to say that, Ed Felton, he's too serious, LaTanya Sweeney, okay, this is the former advisor to the FTC. This is the next advisor to the FTC. This is the next deputy White House CTO. This is every European regulator. This is some in industry. So that train has left. And what we really need to do is come up with more careful terminology, because I don't know that any consumer ever got well, I don't really know much about you, but I can upload your transactions and append them, but still not know anything about you. We need to lean in, apologies, Sheryl Sandberg, to say, I know you personally, I'm in your home, I'm trying to help you control your house, your health, your weather, everything about you. And did you see what Amazon did recently? They don't even say anymore, right? And I don't have to read Amazon's privacy policy, right? It's always been clear that they track, but they changed the terminology. It's no longer, this is selected. It's these links, these offers are inspired by your browsing, right? So we need to lean in, embrace, and that does mean giving more control in return for more data and making it very clear, you ain't gonna get hurt, we promise. It's not gonna be used for all the kinds of things that Bob would point to and say that it's wrong. If we wanna be the trusted player in the pill in my stomach, on my wearable, in my watch, in my brain, in my whatever it is, in my virtual reality world, there's a huge profitable world to be made by leaning in and giving up some control to users.
Yes, Bob, do you think that there is a good way now for users to control this if they don't want that data collected and tracked?
No, I don't think there is. You have to be very geeky in order to maintain some degree of control. An ad blocker, the interesting thing is the rise of ad blockers. People have learned how to do that in increasing numbers, but that's not enough. That doesn't go anywhere near enough. I haven't seen an ad in 10 years on my computer, but I also use something called NoScript. It's a very geeky add-on that has to be unblocked a fair amount of the time in order for websites to function, but it gives me the capability of killing very specific scripts. Google Analytics never runs on my computer. A whole series of other things like that never run on my computer. There's no way I could get my wife to do any of that. She can use a computer, but she's not geeky enough or interested enough to be able to deal with that, and I think that's basically most people.
I think, too, though, there's two things. So you're talking about blocking ads. That actually, unfortunately, doesn't even stop device fingerprinting in other ways. So the data collection, I would agree, it cannot be stopped in the current ecosystem. However, what has happened is, you're not seeing ads, and that's not stopping people from gathering data on you. And anyone who's potentially using device fingerprinting, I'd say, would be more nefarious. And yet people who you might want to see offers from, or it would make sense, you're blocking them. So in an ironic sense, the people who are punished the most are probably some of the better players.
Sorry. So in terms of your question of what else has changed, while this doesn't necessarily have to do specifically with advertisers, I think consumers have also gotten quite aware of data breaches, right? So now that there is harm to collection, whether it's happening at Target or whether it's happening from just incidental digital footprints that we're leaving. And I would also say that the other thing that has happened, and literally happened yesterday, I think, is it's not just California, right? It's Europe in terms of potential regulation. So now we're talking about big data not as a potential privacy problem, but also a potential antitrust.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And in Europe, we're talking about the large first parties, Google and Facebook, as potentially violating antitrust laws by collecting too much data. So what about the, and, you've looked at this, the industry's opt-out tool. Is there reason to think that that is working?
No, I think, so there's empirical evidence that it frequently doesn't work, and whether it frequently doesn't work because of technical problems, which are not necessarily the fault of either the network or the publisher. There's also very little uptake, right? So when you think about ad choices and that box, I think 11% of people who visit a website actually see it, right? But we're here because of ad blockers, so clearly there's some market solution to that that's happening as well.
But I think the BBB does a good job at policing that. I think, just last week, 2 weeks ago, Jeannie and the crew brought an action identifying problems with one particular company. The NAI, I think, runs a regular script that tests whether their participating companies are opting out. I just worry that, what do I tell people, when they opt out? I said, well, you won't get ads based on your cross-website surfing. That doesn't count for cross-device. Location, well, there still might be location used in this way and that way. There might be fingerprinting that may or may not be subject to it. It's gotten so complicated that, we shouldn't stop. We did a huge job, and boy, was it hard getting everyone in the world under, a giant umbrella. And so you have to have a consensus around that. But we need to continue moving the ball forward. It becomes old pretty soon, and you've got to continue updating, not just to deal with cross-device, but to deal with communicating to, we keep arguing, why don't consumers know this? Why don't they like it? Why don't they want it? And so forth. And my argument is I see people donating like ad impressions, like donated ad impressions. I know where those end up. Those show me the viewability and the ROI on raising consumer awareness about an ad-supported ecosystem, right? We aren't spending time at least making that argument to users, and then we're surprised that there's this general sort of, oh, I'd really rather block the ads if I could.
And so even if we're talking about failed self-regulation, that isn't necessarily mean that we should then go to good old regulation, right? So there's a first best and a second best here.
So let me ask other questions. Yes.
Well, I have a few, but I'm only going to ask one. I want to go back to that antitrust question, and I want to look at it a different way, which is the theme I'm hearing on Madison Avenue now is the persistent ID and the notion that there's only a couple of stakeholders that really control it. Google and Facebook for one, but every major agency is now trying to create their own persistent ID so that they can identify and unify the view of those consumers across all those platforms and places they go. I'm just wondering, why wouldn't that represent a constraint of trade in the industry right now on Madison Avenue? Every agency I talk to says it's Google, Facebook, and then everybody else. And increasingly they have to do business with Google and Facebook in order to get a sense of who they're targeting. Couldn't that become an industry constraint of trade issue at some point soon here?
So I think there's a difference here, and this is a specific question, between how Europe would look at that question and how the US would. Because even if the answer to that is yes, in the US you then still have to go many steps further in terms of regulation, right, to show that not only is there a perhaps market issue, but that there is harm that is actually taking place because of it. Whereas in Europe, it's a much lower bar. So,
really hard to see how you end up with a restraint of trade where the argument is, well, they should let more people sell data and trade it more easily, and that you can show consumer harm if you provide more privacy. The FTC seems to think very, differently.
My question isn't about the data, it's about the unifying principle, the unique. The persistent ID is what enables Google or Facebook to organize all that data. They control that because they've gotten users to opt into these multi-devices or whatever through universal logins, all the mechanisms they use. That's where the power is, that they can unify the data, not that they have the data. And that's my question. Isn't that at some point a restraint of trade?
Let me ask. I think that some.
It's data. You're calling it a unique neighbor, but it's a data. It's a data point that lets you.
Jules, I think that this came up in the U.S. also with the Do Not Track effort. when some of the ad tech companies said that a browser-based do not track standard was going to affect them a lot more than it was going to affect the large first parties. And at least one FTC commissioner, I think Maureen Olhausen, has said that that's something that she was concerned about. I don't know, Siona, do you have a sense of whether that's comparable to what's happening in Europe now, or?
So Bob and I were talking about outside whether FTC statements, so they're signaling that they're paying attention, but I don't know if that rises to the standard of potential regulation.
And if the FTC, if we get a Republican president, the FTC will turn around and march the other way.
And again, remember where we were. Everyone had their own cookies. You had to go through all kinds of hops and jumps. Now you can buy and sell because there are two global identifiers, right? We're awash in syncing and coordinating data, and yes, obviously, big players have an advantage, and if Apple makes it harder because they decide that they want to support a non-ad supported model, it'd be hard to see, but we'll leave that to the FTC.
So Jason Kent from DCN, represent the premium publishers. Just connecting the dots on some things I've heard. So Jules, you mentioned Do Not Track was a missed opportunity. And Wendy, you mentioned the standard is now out there. We know ad blocking is at least somewhat caused by data collection and not having a constraint on it, privacy issues. And I've heard that we have a self-regulatory program that's hard to actually act on. Why not, with Do Not Track built into the browser, why not have a self-regulatory program that actually honors that signal from the consumer? Wouldn't that solve for part of ad blocking? Give me a good answer.
So here's my pushback. We do nothing until everyone agrees, and I get that it's hard to, but there's nothing that stops any individual company, and boy, there are some that are quietly doing so because they don't want to get beat up, you know, by maybe conceding that they do so, but there's nothing that stops folks other than they don't have partners who are necessarily ready to sort of cooperate. So you see EFF and the ad blocker saying, here's our standard, if you want to not get blocked, follow it. But the OPA or the responsible advertisers or publishers of the world could say, well, we'll use it only to, and Bob may not be happy, and maybe not, you know, David Vladeck, but we'll use it as a better way to turn off behavioral ads. We'll treat it as a equivalent to the, you know, industry piece. Like, let's start there, right? Like, why shouldn't that be a place where everybody starts? When you see the signal, treat it like an opt-out cookie, right? We argued that that would have been the place to start and save 5 years of arguing, you know, and the critics wouldn't be happy, but that would be a thing, and then we could debate whether it goes any further than that.
Right. So, and I think the only issue there is everybody has to play ball to an extent, and the only argument against it is the third parties, the intermediaries, the companies that aren't lined up for the best interest of the consumers have a very powerful lobbying force to avoid that. So, I mean, I think that's a fundamental issue we have to solve.
There is some evidence that consumers respond to better privacy practices. I don't think it's all that clear. I don't think it's all that deep, but I think that could be encouraged by better players. You know, I don't know that Jules and I would necessarily agree on the specific solution here, but I do agree with him that for the most part, solutions are found somewhere in the middle of the road. It's the only way that any kind of agreement, but as long as people in industry, and the problem with industry trade groups is the most conservative voices always win. So there's no compromise.
Do you guys remember how ad choices started? It was the terrible thing. Industry hated it. eBay started labeling its ads because it believed that it wanted to give better notice about how it was using data. And you should have seen people freaking out when Scott Shipman would present at an FTC, oh, you better say that that's just you and Yahoo who can do that together. And then it turned out that the industry could do it and did do it. And so sometimes you need leading practices that end up, hey, look at that, we can all do that, the sky didn't fall in. And then you can have self-regulation and best practices and a good norm.
So we're going to wrap, but we're going to continue this discussion, in fact, right now. Wendy, panel, thank you very much for starting us off on this.
Thank you.
Let me invite David to the stage.